For those of you that don't, great. For those of you that don't know me, and I think I do know everybody pretty much that's on right now, I'm Bridget McDaniel, and I co-chair the Education and Advocacy Committee for the League with Sally Morgan. And Sally and I had the distinct pleasure of being in a meeting recently on the One ID program in Columbus, the potential for One ID in Columbus. And we heard Michael Wilco's talk spontaneously, and it was fascinating. His depth and detail of his knowledge of statistics related to the 2020 census just blew Sally and I away. And we thought, oh, this is something that we know that a lot of League members would be interested in. Michael's Senior Vice President of Community Impact for United Way of Central Ohio. He and his team developed strategies to improve the community and also how work with funding some of their 80 different nonprofits to help implement those strategies. Prior to working with United Way, he was with the Columbus Foundation, and he did community research with the Columbus Foundation. Michael has a bachelor's degree in geography and a master's degree in city and regional planning, both from the Ohio State University. He sits on a number of boards, and he is really a sought-after speaker in the community, and I think you'll find out why as we go through the evening. We are going to just turn it over to Michael here in a second. We're going to ask you to hold your questions if possible, so we can all hear the presentation. Your questions might get answered, and we've left lots of time at the end of the presentation for questions. So jot them down, put them in chat. We can read them from chat if you want to capture your thoughts as we go through. And with that, I welcome you, Michael. We appreciate you being here, and we're looking forward to hearing all about the impact of changing demographics in our Central Ohio region.
Great. Well, thank you, Bridget, and everybody so much for letting me come and spend time with you this evening. I grew up in Youngstown and came to Columbus as a college student, and I was really impressed as a kid that there was this one place in the state of Ohio that seemed to be attracting people and was growing. And I've been studying Columbus ever since I was probably 13 years old. What's important about the census and what it represents is with our nonprofit sector, they are constantly just dealing with the mobility of poverty and changing demographics and neighborhoods that are on the rise and neighborhoods that are struggling. And so it's always helpful in order to put that into context. So what I want to do with you in the next 30 minutes or so is give us a new common understanding of what I learned and some of the things that kind of fascinated me about the census, and we'll see what kind of resonates with all of you. Let me take over the screen here. Someone can give me a heads up or a thumbs up when it is in full screen. Are you viewing my screen? Oh. I see
Yeah.
it. Let's try that again.
Okay.
Are you seeing a blank screen?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Let me just go out and try again. And it seemed to have closed my presentation. I'm not sure what's really happening here, but let's. Are we just back to the Zoom now?
Yeah, we're back to the
Okay.
all the folks.
And what are you seeing now?
Now we see your actual computer screen. And now it went blank again. I think when you're hitting full screen, for some reason, it's going blank.
Let me just check something out here. I'm going to leave the Zoom and I'll come back into your meeting. How about if we try
Okay. That? Okay.
Right there.
I hope he can get back in. Here he comes.
All right, so I have rejoined all of you, and now
Okay.
are we up?
Yeah, good.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Through the technology. All right, here we go. So one of the things about Columbus, as we know, is we are a rapidly growing metropolitan region, but 90% of all of the growth in the state of Ohio was actually in Columbus and our suburbs. If you actually look at the one-year estimates that just came out, Columbus grew another 10,000 people. The rest of the state actually lost 20,000 people in the last 12 months outside of Columbus. So we are the economic engine of the state. If you look at how metropolitan Columbus is growing, the growth by decade has only been inching up slightly. It feels like we've been growing much more rapidly, and here's why. In this most recent period from 2010 to 2020 on the far right, what you see is that 70% of all of the growth of metropolitan Columbus happened in Franklin County. In the previous decade, just 43% of metro growth was in Franklin County. So while the metropolitan region is not growing any more quickly, that growth rapidly moved inward into Franklin County. So now here we are with Columbus. We're 906,000 people within the city limits. The city actually jumped Indianapolis and San Francisco. Fort Worth jumped us. We became the 14th largest city. But what happened in the last 10 years was it was the highest percentage increase in 70 years in the city of Columbus. And through a numeric lens, it was the largest numeric increase ever recorded in a decennial census in Columbus history. And I think a lot of people are surprised when they learn that Columbus, in fact, is growing faster than a lot of high growth markets like Nashville and Houston and Dallas and Phoenix. While some of these cities on the screen have metropolitan regions growing faster than Metro Columbus, it's really a testament to how much growth has occurred within the city limits of Columbus. For those of you that have been here a long time, you know that Columbus has been growing through annexation, but annexation really came to a stop in the last decade. And while the land area of Columbus barely budged 1.5%, somehow we managed to squeeze 119,000 people into the existing city. The point here, and by the way, this is a Google aerial of the Bethel Sawmill Road corridor of Northwest Columbus. There are no neighborhoods in Columbus that have been unaffected by the change that happened in this last decade because of how much growth started to come inward. And the other thing is Columbus is starting to go vertical. These are 3 projects in the downtown that all represent housing, the scale of which we've never seen in our region. We also see projects like this happening in those near downtown neighborhoods, which are causing all kinds of conversations about race and class and gentrification and scale and density and zoning. And we see projects like this happening in suburban environments that include, condos and apartments and office buildings and retail, entertainment and office. The density and scale of these kinds of projects we've never seen before. And I'll point to the one in the top right, which is Bridge Park in Dublin, which is representing a failed strip mall. And as Dublin recognizes that the vast majority of their built environment are larger single family homes, and the demographics of the future include looking at really young people or older people, both of which are looking for lifestyle and convenience, and they're not looking for those 4,000 square foot big homes anymore, and Dublin is responding to that. So now let's compare what happened here with the rest of the country. If you look at the screen, go to the bottom of the screen first. And what you'll see is that growth in the United States went from 9.7%, it slowed to 7.4%. It was the slowest population growth in America since the 1930s, and growth in the United States slowed by about 26 points. By the way, if you look at the one-year estimates that just came out, 18 US states had negative population change. That's never been recorded in US history. But if you look at Columbus at the top, while growth in America slowed 26%, it increased in Columbus by 50%. And growth in Franklin County increased significantly. And statewide, it increased just a little bit because we saw some improvements in places like Cincinnati and the Akron market. The other thing that happened in Central Ohio is the growth is everywhere. What you see on this slide in orange are all those communities where there is growth, but not as fast as the 13.8% for Franklin County. And in blue are all of the places that are growing more quickly than Franklin County. It used to be that all the growth in Columbus was really on the north end, the Dublin, Powell, right into Delaware County. This is the most evenly distributed we've ever seen growth. We have growth in the inner ring suburbs, Whitehall, Bexley, Arlington, Worthington, Grandview, where there is no greenfield development. And we have high growth markets like Grove City and Pickerington and Canal Winchester on the south end, and we have high growth markets on the north end. And by the way, I don't know that I put it in here, but Whitehall is growing for the first time in 50 years as the demographic shift is really affecting that community as well. If you put this into perspective, every single day, there's 44 more people in this county than when the day began. And on an annual basis, we had more than 16,000 people every 12 months. That's a really good size small city that we add to Franklin County on an annual basis. So here we are with the county, 13.8% growth. If you look at this map in red, show those places that recorded a pretty significant population loss. In green and the lighter colors are all the places that are growing. I'm going to point out two places of multiple census tracts connected to one another that are losing people despite this growth. The first is here where you see my little hand on the screen, everywhere from Cosi, running out Sullivan and West Broad Street from Cosi to Hollywood Casino. All of that area is losing households and losing people as the West Side continues to struggle under really social issues, perception, crime and violence, and really the opioid epidemic. The other area that honestly I was very surprised is losing people are all of these areas south of Children's Hospital, running down Parsons Avenue, Miller, Kelton, Whittier. All of those areas are losing people, not because that area is on decline, but because it's on the rapid rise. And families with school-aged children that live in rental housing are being replaced by a single professional who might be working at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and they are renovating houses or buying renovated houses, and there might be one person or maybe two people living there. I point these two extremes out because if we look at a single indicator, population growth, population loss, for 60 years, we were able to make really clear ideas when we would look at a map like this, and we would be able to say, oh, if a neighborhood's losing people, then that neighborhood must not be doing well. Well, that relationship's no longer true. Conversely, we might look at an area that's growing in population and say, oh, that area must be attractive, people must be moving in there, that must be a neighborhood on the rise. That relationship is also no longer true, and you'll see that here in a minute. Despite all of this growth, all of the growth in the city of Columbus was due to increases in diversity. The white population for the city of Columbus actually fell, despite the fact that it was the largest numeric increase in our history. Similarly, all of the growth in Franklin County was due to increases in diversity. If we don't have a strong DE&I platform in our neighborhood, in our social organizations, where we work, it's not just about where we're headed, it's about where we've been going for some time, and it is a huge defining characteristic of what's happened in the last decade. Here are the numbers. You can scan the chart. I don't have to read it for you. I'll point out a couple things. The white population only went down by 0.4%. And what you see here is a significant increase of 65% in the Asian population, a 64% in the Hispanic, but a surge in people who identify.
Freeze warnings, turn off the water, the outside hoses and stuff before you go to bed tonight.
Because all, mute.
Because you'll do it tonight, tomorrow night.
Excuse me, if everybody on the call could mute their computer, that would be great. Thank you. What's happened also is that these are the census classifications, which might no longer work to align with how we identify who we are. There are people who a decade ago or 20 years ago said, I identify as white or I identify as Black, but maybe they now are more in touch with how their family has evolved and they now identify with other or two or more races. So some of this change is also about the classifications, but what happened in Franklin County really is aligning with some of those national statistics, but it's also about who's moving in, and it's also about a declining birth rate among the white population. So here's what happened with regard to the diversity index. In Franklin County, we went from a diversity index from 50 out of 100 to 60 out of 100. You'll see the definition momentarily, but on this map in green, shows all the places that got more diverse, which is everywhere. The increase in diversity, it's not happening just in urban Columbus or in the city of Columbus or inner ring suburbs and outer ring suburbs. It's everywhere. There's 3 places on this map, though, however, where diversity drops. Out by Hollywood Casino, north of OSU, and north of Broad Street in Whitehall. That's only because either a lot of housing got built, housing got demolished, and those places were incredibly diverse 10 years ago. They're still diverse today. They're just not as diverse as what they were. So they're kind of anomalies, okay? So you can read the description of the USA Today Gallup Diversity Index. Now you're looking at a map that shows where are there diverse communities and where are there homogeneous communities. In red, you see all the places that are homogeneous. Let's ignore all of this area down here south of Grove City because it's very rural, it's very agricultural, and very few people live there. And by the way, if you don't spend a lot of time looking at census tract maps like I do, if you look at this line right here, look at this big area, right? Well, that's the same number of people there as that tiny little red right there in the middle, okay? Because most census tracts are sized according to how many people live there. So now let's zoom in and talk about where are the most homogeneous places in Franklin County. And there are 6 of them. Bexley, Bexley, right here, German Village, Marion Village, Schumacher Place, Grandview running all the way through Arlington. This is Clintonville and Old Worthington. These are the most homogeneous places in 2020. 4 of them are in suburbs, 2 of them are in the city of Columbus, but 5 of the 6 is where redlining and segregation policies were originally deployed when those communities were built. And they are, as we know, very desirable. In generation after generation likes to stay in those communities, except for German Village, which has a lot of in and out. But we should reflect on why is it that there are so many places in Franklin County that in 2020 look like the demographics of 1920. However, Dublin and New Albany, which may be homogeneous economically, Dublin and New Albany are far more diverse racially and ethnicity-wise than, say, Clintonville and Arlington. Because Dublin and New Albany have been built entirely in the post-civil rights era, and while they might represent large exclusive homes because of the way they were built, they do represent a different kind of suburban ideology with greater diversity. So now let's zoom in about what neighborhoods in Columbus really shocked me in these changes. Number 1 is Linden. Linden is now growing for the first time in 60 years. 11 out of 12 census tracts showed population growth. The only tract in Linden that had population loss was statistically insignificant at less than 1%. And when I saw this originally, I thought, oh my, after all the years of Coleman and the Ginther administration really focused on Linden, Linden is turning the corner. I don't think that's true. Let's dive a little deeper. So Linden, a 7% population growth, that's a very respectable growth. It's up 2,600 people. And we see the new Linden Rec Center, which is amazing. And thank you, City of Columbus, for building it. However, when you dive a little deeper, the number of housing units in Linden fell almost 4%. There's 652 less structures in Linden than 10 years ago. Now, I work in the nonprofit sector, and what do the nonprofits tell people like me? as people are getting evicted, as young people can't start houses on their own, as people are choosing to live doubled up because they know they can't afford housing, where are people living doubled up? It's places like Linden. And for 60 years, the number of people living in the typical American home was getting fewer and fewer people. That trend stopped and reversed itself as chronic underbuilding, driven by massive population growth coming into Columbus, resulted in a place like Linden, which went from 2.2 people per housing unit to 2.6. The other thing about Linden is it had the second largest reduction in vacant and abandoned housing anywhere in Franklin County, or 39% of all the vacant structures disappeared. That's 1,083 less vacant structures. Now look at these pictures that I found on Google. Linden has relatively simple housing stock. Some of that housing stock, particularly north of Hudson, is very simple and not very old. We're not talking about 3,500 square foot, homes from 1880 on the Near East Side. When the market demanded housing, Linden was a place that kind of got pulled into that narrative. Now, back to the city effort, we do know the city of Columbus is focused on Linden, and the city of Columbus removed 403 blighted abandoned properties over that 10-year period, but the number of vacant structures fell by 1,100. This suggests that the market returned 600 or 700 vacant structures, came back online as either people purchased them or property owners found an economically viable use for them. Interestingly enough, when you look at Linden's demographics, remember when I said the white population fell in Columbus and the white population fell in Franklin County? It actually inched up 0.3% in Linden, but the growth in Linden was also not being driven by an increase in the Black population, but in 2 or more other and Hispanic. Linden is also a much more diverse community, as these demographic forces are also playing out in a community like Linden, which, as we all know, has been, fairly homogeneous for a while, but it's starting to become more diverse. Now I want to move to Northland, which honestly was the absolute most exciting thing I found in all the data. Every single census tract in Northland added population. In fact, anywhere from 4% to 35%. What you see on this map, here's 71 on the left side. Here we have 270. I carved out Easton, which is right here, and this is Westerville Road. So I'm going all the way to the end of Linden. This is, in fact, a larger geography than the official boundaries of Northland, but I want to show what's happening on the north end of the city. And before I do that, I also want to point out, why is Northland such a mecca of revitalization? We've got Polaris here, Easton here, John Glenn Airport's over here, downtown's here, OSU's over there. Linden and Northland are surrounded by major employment centers everywhere. And with the growth of the region and the chronic underbuilding, the north side of the city had a very different experience. So in Northland, think about this. Northland added an entire city of Bexley in the last 10 years within its boundaries. And here we see the new North Side Library on Carl Road, which is a great representation of civic architecture and civic purpose, right? But Northland is growing faster than Columbus and Franklin County. And yet, there's only 484 more housing units in Northland with 14,000 more people living there. This has never happened before, right? And think about it. Someone like me as a single individual might have lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in 2010. And if I think the neighborhood's maybe not what I want it to be, and I pick up and move out, and who replaces me? Maybe a family of 5 or 6 from another country. That's how Northland was able to grow. But more importantly, Northland was #1 in Franklin County for the reduction of vacant and abandoned housing. What you see here is an apartment complex on Northtown Boulevard near Tamarack Circle, where in 2011, the entire apartment complex was offline. Think about it. It was a very weak housing market in 2010, and Northland was a weak neighborhood. But there were 1,924 existing housing units that were able to be brought back, because now you look at that same apartment complex on Google Street View, and it's got new windows, new doors, and it's been freshened up and it's been repurposed, right? So while the number of Structures is only up 1%. The number of occupied housing units is up 7%, but the population is up 15%. Here are the demographics for Northland. I'm not going to read the slide, but let's point out the one column in the middle for the Asian population, where just 10 years ago, there were only 2,000 people who identified as Asian, and by 2020, it was 7,600, or a 276% increase in the Asian population. Northland is now one of our large Asian communities, but it's mostly Nepali Bhutanese. But you also see the 2 or more or other additional increases, as like the city and the county, the white population slipped by 2%. What do we know about Northland? Well, when Northland Mall closed and Lazarus, Sears, and JCPenney relocated to other opportunities, believe it or not, as recently as 1997, Northland was #1 in the state of Ohio in retail sales. No other zip code beat Northland, driven by Northland Mall and the car dealerships. Within 10 years of the close of the mall, however, it was not looking good. But a local geographer pulled every single business permit the city of Columbus issued in the 8 years following the close of the mall and found that of the more than 180 new businesses started on Morse Road, the vast majority had either a Latino or African surname, which means that Northland really is more entrepreneurial and more local than the short north. It happened very organically, as chain stores picked up and moved out as they followed the migration of those higher income households. But because the global diaspora is playing out in these neighborhoods in Northland, there is this resurgence of the dollar turning over in Northland and staying in Northland to the point where the retail vacancy on Morse Road is almost non-existent. So now let's move to the Near East Side. The Near East Side gets a lot of attention as really a gentrification narrative. What's interesting is the population barely budged. It's only up 554 people. And when I say the Near East Side, I'm talking about from 670 all the way south to Livingston, between downtown and Bexley. It's a big, big area, and north of Broad and south of Broad are behaving a little differently. But no other place than the Near East Side had a more dramatic racial shift than the Near East Side. If you look here, the white population surged from 19 to 37%, and the Black population fell from 75 to 58. That is some significant racial flip-flopping in a 10-year period. So if you live on the Near East Side, the conversation is about gentrification, and it's about class, and it's about race, but that's not what's happening across the city, okay? If you look at these two neighborhoods over a longer window, and that's what we need to do to have a thoughtful conversation. If you look at that red bar, that's north of Broad, which has really been the heart of the Black community for a century. And really the racial demographics of north of Broad just started to shift really in the last 10 years, but it started to shift between 2000 and 2010. Now let's go to south of Broad, from Broad to Livingston, downtown to Bexley. That neighborhood has been on a racial roller coaster, right? It went from 4% Black to 40% to 80%. It stayed above 80% for 20 years, and now it has plummeted to only 42% Black. And yet the city of Columbus has this much more predictable, you see with the dashed line, right? So the city's having one experience, north of Broad is having a second experience, and south of Broad is having a third experience. And it's confusing, right? And this is why I say we need to have really thoughtful and organized conversations, not just about what's happening right now, but what's happening over a longer period of time. If you look at the Near East Side, and this is what I think is so critical when we think about urban Columbus, there used to be 53,000 people living there. It plummeted, right? And it really has bottomed out, and it's starting to turn the corner. But when people talk about, well, the Near East Side doesn't have a grocery store and Main Street looks the way it does, it's because you've lost 2/3 of your population. And yet this issue around scale and density and 4- and 5-story buildings is really causing a stir. And what do you normally see? You see homeowners organizing typically to stop 4- and 5-story apartment buildings. The reality is, for where I sit, you're never going to get that neighborhood back to its original vitality unless you have a very different kind of built environment moving forward. The Near East Side also was third in its reduction in vacant and abandoned housing. It fell 34%. There are 1,200 less vacant structures in that neighborhood than 10 years ago, as again, the population growth and chronic underbuilding is driving people to seek housing wherever they can find it. And this is what we see, right? All over the Near East Side, you're seeing property prices that are just skyrocketing. If you just look at the example in the top center on this slide, you see a house that went from $15,000 to nearly $400,000. Now, when you go to Google Street View and you look at that house on North 22nd, you'll also see that, well, there used to be tarps on the roof and boards on the window, and it was a very distressed property. Similarly, in the south of Broad, you're seeing the same kind of escalation. Look at the house on the top left, which went from $220,000 to nearly $1 million in about 7 years, right? What we don't know is how much money are people investing in these properties. The only thing we do know is what did they sell for previously? What are they selling for now? And what is that improvement doing to the people who live in the neighborhood? And how is that putting a squeeze on people who struggle? What's important about a place like Northland? Northland is also seeing prices jump, not because wealthy people are moving into Northland. Northland is becoming more economically vulnerable, but there's more and more low-income people competing against a fixed supply of housing, which is driving prices up in Northland as well. So where's the Black population growing? Well, the Black population was up 21%. What you see here in red are all of the places where the Black population is dropping. In green are all the places where the Black population is increasing. Across the central city, near OSU, a few portions of Linden, but really the Near East Side, Milo Grogan, the near South Side, a significant drop in the Black population. What the census does not tell us, how much of this is gentrification, how much is displacement, and how much is choice. All three of those things are going on. We just don't really know to what degree. The number one place where the Black population fell was Franklinton. What you see here from Google Street View is the former Riverside Bradley Columbus Metropolitan housing community. It got replaced by a market rate River and Rich. If the Black population in your neighborhood falls 61% in a decade, you're going to notice. Where's the Black population growing? Right here. Northeast Columbus, this is Google satellite of a development by MI Homes called Upper Albany West, and it is the number one place for the increase in the Black population. 3 census tracts, what you can see is 0.14, 0.09, 0.15. All 3 of these tracts are right next to each other. They all touch the city of New Albany, and the Black population there jumped from 900 to 2,800 in a decade. And a year ago, New Albany High School started an official NAACP chapter, as 10% of New Albany High School are now identified as Black. What's happening with the white population? Well, a very clear pattern. In red, you can see all of the places where the white population really dropped quickly. Lots of places in Northland, everywhere from really the edge of Bexley all the way out through Reynoldsburg, and then again from Cosi all the way out to Hollywood Casino. While the white population only slipped by a couple thousand people, Franklin County went from being 69% white to a little more than 60%. If the rate of demographic change continues, it's possible that by the end of this decade, there will no longer be a racial majority in Franklin County. Largest decreases in the white population, Whitehall, 72% of the white population left in a decade, 61% along Hamilton Road by Eastland Mall, and a single tract in Northland saw their white population fall 42%. Where's the white population growing? The number one place is the census tract with the Urban League and the King Arts Complex. What you see here are just a picture of 2 houses from Google Street View on St. Clair Avenue. I went and snapped that same picture 10 years later, and voila, it really represents what's happening in that neighborhood, right? But what's fascinating, right? As the white population is moving into neighborhoods that were redlined and segregated, and the Black population is moving out to Westerville, Gahanna, Pickerington, Reynoldsburg, that tends to be Black households of choice with school-aged children that are moving to those higher income places for the same reasons everybody else is moving there. But the white households moving in often don't have school-aged children. So while the neighborhoods are getting far more diverse, look at that diversity index. Portion of the Near East Side went from being 26 to 42. It was a homogeneous neighborhood. Now the Near East Side is more diverse, but the schools aren't diverse because that's not who's moving in. And similarly, Asian population's up 65%. This is a map. In red shows where Asian people do not live. In green shows where Asian people do live. And there are some clear patterns. There's an Asian community near the Ohio State University, along Bethel Road, Sawmill, heading out into all of Dublin, the new emerging Asian community in Northland. There's a significant Asian community in New Albany and a burgeoning one in Reynoldsburg. What I can't tell you based on the data, which one is Japanese, which one is Chinese, which one is Korean, which one is Nepali Bhutanese. We have the largest Asian community in the state. It is the most diverse and it is growing at the fastest rate. In this map in green shows all of the places where the Hispanic population increased. So this map is not about where Hispanics live and don't live, it's about where the growth is increasing. Now, if the Hispanic population goes from 4.8 to 6.9%, that's not huge, but keep in mind, the pie, the size of Franklin County's population got a lot bigger. And so if the base population is getting a lot bigger and your market share goes from 4.8 to 6.9, that is a significant movement. So what is the most diverse place in all of Franklin County? The far west side, just outside 270, on the other side of Hollywood Casino. If you know where that Home Depot is, it is the neighborhood south of Home Depot, the most diverse place. And this is typical because where do we see the greatest diversity? The Northlands, Eastlands, and Westlands. Why? The housing stock is good, but it's not old enough to be interesting to gentrifiers, and it's really not new enough to be commanding a high price. What's the most homogeneous? Upper Arlington, Lane Avenue, behind Whole Foods is the least diverse place in all of Franklin County, which of course is one of many communities, both in Columbus and in those inner ring suburbs, that deployed restrictive covenants that prohibited people of color from ever owning property. And 100 years later, they still represent that diversity, or lack thereof, I should say. Okay, now what does this do with us? Growth, underbuilding. We have, as everybody knows, a critical scarcity of available housing at every price point and every typology. More importantly, what we are building doesn't really match the demographics of how we're changing, because zoning laws are really about large homes or single family lots, right? And we need accessory dwelling units. We need greater density. We need places for seniors, right? And that's not really what we're building, because often that's not always either allowed through code, or neighborhood groups in Columbus and the suburbs often oppose it. If you look at just the vacant housing, there are 9,417 less vacant houses in this county than 10 years ago, and our housing vacancy rate by the time the census was done was lower than San Francisco. We have a problem, and it's about to be a crisis. What happened in this community? We were able to accommodate 24,000 more people moving into Franklin County, and we didn't have to build a single house because it was already here, unoccupied. Now, there's very little vacant housing left in this community. And if it is vacant and boarded up, it either has legal issues, structural issues, or major issues that are going to cause it to be very expensive to bring it back. If we cannot get production to increase, and given the growth that Intel will provide, the housing escalation prices that we've been experiencing, I believe, are here to stay. This is what I learned from going over all this data. Regional growth has been consistent with the last couple decades, but that shifted and came inward into Franklin County in a way that we didn't really predict. Neighborhoods that have been losing population for decades are now growing, whether or not you see housing construction there or not. Linden, Northland. You never used to see neighborhoods losing housing units, but gaining people. Significant increase in diversity in suburban Columbus, really Northeast and East Columbus, and Northeast and East suburbs. With regard to the Black population, other diverse populations, more Hilliard, Dublin. Significant increase in white people moving into the central city without kids. All of our growth is due to diversity. That will likely continue. And while in the housing bucket, we've had an inadequate housing supply, this dramatic decrease in vacant housing means our housing struggle is a new normal. As I reflect on all of this region is going to continue to grow and reshape itself. Here you have a picture of what's happening in the 5th by Northwest corridor, which was a very high growth part of Franklin County. This is the 5th Avenue, King Avenue in Columbus, but near Upper Arlington and Grandview, where Columbus is really allowing these higher density places. And why are they building there? Because there's a sea of construction cranes at the Ohio State University, adding thousands of jobs. We need the housing there. But you also must reflect between the Wexner Medical Center here in the top left, adding 5,000 jobs. Top right is the new research park that's going in at Kenny and Lane. Bottom right is Intel. The bottom left is Nationwide Children's Hospital. We have huge job generators that are adding very, very high paying jobs. We are at the beginning of a transformational shift. And we will add 1 million more people by 2050. What you see happening all up and down High Street is really bearing the brunt of these demographic forces, as those High Street neighborhoods have typically embraced this kind of growth. But I also want to pause and say, if we add 1 million people in the next 30 years and the poverty rate stays the same, and the number of people who live between 100 and 200% poverty, the working poor, if that percentage stays the same, we have 300,000 more low-income people coming. And I would say to you, take out the map. Where do you want to put 300,000 more people who economically struggle? Because right now it's Northland, Eastland, and Westland. And we are not building housing for low-income people. The only way we've been able to accommodate that is to really allow neighborhoods to fall into disrepair. But now even neighborhoods falling into disrepair are seeing their housing prices jump because of competition. So for me, we're gonna have to build a lot more housing. It's gonna have to be more compact and dense. And we have to build a greater diversity of housing typology that really matches the needs of the households of the future. The households of the future will not be 2 adults with multiple school-aged children. That's not the growth of the future. So where are we now? There's 4 things I want to bring to your attention that I think are a huge opportunity for us to get control of this stuff. 1, source of income protection. Bexley passed that in September of 2020, which simply states, all legal sources of income must be included to qualify people for an apartment. Social Security disability, alimony, child support. I believe when Bexley passed that ordinance, they were the 7th community in the state of Ohio to do so. Columbus, Whitehall, Worthington, Westerville, and Reynoldsburg have followed suit. About 83% of Franklin County now has that protection, and places like Grandview and Arlington and others are considering it. If you don't live in those 6 communities that have passed a source of income protection, I ask you to please speak to your elected officials. Please advocate for that, because it might be the quickest thing we could do to move towards a housing justice platform. Number 2, CODA will likely be on the ballot for an $8 billion thing called Link Us. We have to pass it. We have to pass it because 1 million people are coming. And we can't build in the future the way we did in the past. And CODA needs to levy or leverage those federal dollars for infrastructure. We can't let that window pass. Columbus bond package. In 2019, the city of Columbus, for the first time ever, put $50 million into the bond package for affordable housing. It leveraged 250 million, and 1,300 affordable housing units were built because of it. Now, Columbus is putting 150 million into the bond package for this fall. If you don't live in Columbus, my question would be, is your community using its bond package to maybe incentivize, bring down the land cost or other things to make sure that your community has a housing justice platform where you can ensure the construction of affordable housing. And then lastly, Columbus is in the process of redesigning its zoning code, which is 70 years old. It was written around the car. It was written during a period where people were trying to use these kinds of tools to exclude the poor and exclude people of color. While every inch of the Columbus zoning code has been rewritten, it needs a complete overhaul. If you don't live in Columbus, is your community looking at your zoning code? And does your zoning code represent a platform of justice? With that, that's a very quick overview. And I, by the way, will send you these slides so you have the maps and the data. This was 59 slides. I have a longer version that has about 130 slides, and I could send that to you as well. So I'll stop, and we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I guess if I can go first, my question is the reliability of the census. How do you feel in terms of its reliability from this recent census?
The census has now released that they have overcounted white and Asian, and they undercounted Black and Hispanic. Despite this now statistical sampling, they believe they got the top line right.
Okay.
And I have these numbers. I'm going to do this by memory, so I'm going to be a little off. They overcounted the white population by like 17,000 people. They overcounted the Asian population by like 2,000. Oh, I'm sorry. If you take the national statistic of over and under counting and apply that to Franklin County,
okay,
it would be like 17,000 more white people got counted than exist, and 2,000 Asian, 9,000 Black people did not get counted, and a couple thousand Hispanics did not get counted. It will change those numbers slightly,
okay,
but not statistically significant. But the point would be we are even more diverse than what those numbers revealed. What I can say to you, Bridget, is in the place like the university district, I do believe the census did not accurately count the university district because they reported about a 3% population drop in the university district, despite the fact that thousands of housing units were built. Now,
okay.
that was probably true in every type of university district in the United States. So what do I think that means? I think that a handful, meaning a handful of thousands, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people did not get counted in Columbus. 15, 20,000 people got labeled inaccurately. And I do know that with new American populations, given the climate that was happening in our country, that was probably also undercounted. All of that being said, it's what we've got. And any of those nuances for us are the same nuances for everybody. And I would say it's pretty darn good despite those challenges.
Okay. How about anybody else? Anybody got questions for Michael? Kitty?
Forgot to unmute. I was concerned, I think, about what you said was a mismatch early on about the data and housing data and what the families of tomorrow are going to want and need. So my question is anything happening to bring those divergent ideas together?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'll give you a great example. If you don't know the term accessory dwelling unit, it would be, the example would be, say, an apartment above a garage. In urban neighborhoods in Columbus, there are a lot of people that do want to rip down, dilapidated old garages and rebuild those garages and put a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment above that garage. What they can do with that apartment is either rent it out to someone, let their kid, who then becomes a young adult, stay in that apartment, but still be close to mom and dad, but have their own space. They could have mom or dad live there as the family becomes a bigger family and has children and babies, right? And so an accessory dwelling unit allows like 3 generations of a family to live in that home. This is happening in my neighborhood. The Civic Association supports it. The Area Commission supports it. The City of Columbus supports it. But you have to go and get 9 variances approved and hire an architect or an attorney to get that done. That's an example where that zoning code is kind of in a mismatch. Another example of that, Kitty, would be the parking ratio. Columbus has a lot of minimum parking standards, and those minimum parking requirements are quite aggressive. And there's a lot of young people, and in urban neighborhoods where we want to build 5- and 6-story buildings on bus lines, right, next to grocery stores, in walkable communities, and a lot of young people, because of e-scooters and Coda and Linkus and Uber and Lyft and all of these things that have come about in the last few years, attitudes around transportation have shifted. But the code is still requiring developers to build buildings like it's the 1970s and the only thing you have is a car. So those are examples of where zoning codes and development need to get a little bit more in line to build the city of the future. What I don't want to see happen, and what I'm worried about with Intel, how does a Johnstown and some of those rural communities who have part-time, township officials who don't have the sophistication of Westerville and Dublin and Columbus, how will they accommodate that growth? My fear is they will react to that growth in the way Pataskala has reacted to that growth by saying, we're only going to let people build 1 house per acre. And we're going to make sure that we stay, agricultural or, rural. And what that does is it forces development to leapfrog further and further out, right? And so I believe that we have some of the most beautiful and productive farmland in the world, and we have to protect it. If we don't build a different kind of city, if we don't build greater density, and if people come, Central Ohio will lose 700 square miles of farmland. And I certainly don't want to wake up in 30 years and find a seamless flow of apartment complexes and low density ranch condominiums all the way from Dublin to the city of Westerville. And I don't want to see that from Winchester all the way to Lancaster. And so if we don't get that under control, that's what will happen. Or in the case of Intel, maybe that development is just going to leapfrog outside of Licking County and go straight to Morrow and Knox. And I think that's a problem. That was a long answer.
No, I live in Licking County in the Johnstown area, and already there's tension, to say the least, about Intel and what's it going to mean.
And what I can say to that, Kitty, is once a large employer gets announced, or once, even if it's something as small and simple as a 4-story apartment building at the corner of Whittier and Yeager on the edge of German Village, right? That is tiny compared to Intel. Both of those have that kind of tension with them. And when a project is announced, that's not when we should be having thoughtful conversations about the city of the future, because now we're having an emotional conversation that's reacting to a specific activity. What I think we need, and what does not currently exist, is this conversation that says, what does the Columbus Metro of 2050, what should it look like? How will we accommodate housing? What will the transportation needs be? Where will the new American communities be, right? We don't normally get opportunities to talk about things in 20 and 30-year timeframes, but as we all know, time goes by, too fast. And I'll say this. And when you think about Livingston Avenue on the Near East Side, right? Thriving, fails. It moves out to James and Livingston. And that fails and it moves to Hamilton Road. And then Hamilton Road failed and it went to Bryce. And Bryce failed and it went to 256. On the north side, Cleveland Avenue and Linden, thriving, it failed, it moved to Northern Lights. Northern Lights moved to Northland, which then went to 161, which then went to Polaris. So over and over in every side of the city, you can set your watch to both the loss of farmland on the periphery and the residual impact of pulling that growth further and further out decimates the communities in those concentric rings like the layers of an onion. And we need to have a more thoughtful policy so we don't just continue to replicate that pattern of letting the onion kind of rot in the core and then get those layers on the outside. And
You
that's-
you mentioned the source of the income protection, which would help people afford to go into the inner suburbs, the Bexleys, the Worthingtons, the Arlingtons. But is there housing stock there for them, or does it have to be built when you, and that's, I guess, does have to be built and there's not much room to build?
That is a great question. And I am not going to tell you that that source of income protection is going to be the silver bullet for the approach. It is one of many solutions that we need to deploy. There will be some housing units that are good, decent, safe, sanitary, great neighborhoods with good schools that will now be available to those people, but it won't be by the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Your question, Barbara, is a more thoughtful question for me, which is about what's getting built. And the reality is land costs are high, lumber is high, and labor is high. And so there is an impossibility. We cannot build affordable new construction unless somebody, right, fill in that blank. It's not going to be the federal government. It's not going to be the state of Ohio. Somebody needs to come to the table and either reduce labor cost, lumber cost, or land cost. And that solution is on our doorsteps as a region, which is why, in my opinion, a zoning code, a transportation policy, a source of income, and bonds that can be issued to subsidize the construction complete a more thoughtful puzzle, and they all have value to get us to a better place of justice.
Thank you.
Yes,
Sue.
Sue.
Thank you very much, Michael. You put forth lots of possibilities of ways to make change, but this is a bigger issue than Franklin County. And you say the state's not going to get involved in funding things, but what sort of regional effort do we have for planning and for seeing that we meet the needs and do the points you emphasize?
It's a great question, and you are absolutely right. It just so happens that United Way of Central Ohio raises money and invests in Franklin County, and that just happens to be where my knowledge sits. None of these issues stop at that Franklin County line. The answer to your question lies with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. They have completed a regional housing strategy that has 118 solutions in it, and those solutions include what's the right thing for Marysville, what's the right thing for Delaware, what's the right thing for Lancaster, and what's the right thing for Brown Township, as well as what should Dublin be doing and what should Columbus be doing. There are solutions at all of that. The reality is we have home rule in Ohio, and that means local communities really have their own jurisdiction. The solution to that is going to be a more cooperative and more of a handshake agreement to kind of do what's right. But and if you are interested in that broader scale, that would go out to the 7 or 10 county region, MORPC could give you that presentation. And what's important there about your question, Sue, is I did an assessment for just Union County. And if you look at the jobs that are in Union County and what they pay and the housing that's getting built in Union County, oh my goodness, is there a mismatch, right? 75% of all the jobs that exist in Union County cannot support the housing that's getting built in Union County. And there are more people who work in Union County, that work in Union County that live in Franklin County. And so what's happening is when you see those larger employers that are out in those adjacent counties, those people are coming into Franklin County to find the housing that fits for them. So let's say you have a decent job, but not a great job, and you're working in one of those counties, you're probably going to be finding those apartment complexes on 161 in Northland. What really is going to concern me, and back to you, Kitty, because of where you live, I keep thinking, where are 7,000 construction workers going to live to work on the Eco plant? And I keep thinking, well, finally, all those motels on Morse Road and 160 Northland are going to be occupied. But do we really want 2 or 3 construction workers living in a hotel room? And what I worry about is how many construction workers from Dayton and Mansfield and Wheeling, West Virginia will drive into Columbus on Monday morning and they'll work through Friday and they'll share a hotel room. And on Friday night, they'll drive back to their families in Dayton and Mansfield and Wheeling, West Virginia. Or I think it's possible that you might see like campgrounds set up near the Intel plant for construction workers. Because think about it, you might be a construction worker that's going to work there for 18 months, but you know, Barbara might be a construction worker who's got a specific skill. So she might only have a 45-day assignment. And you know, Lucy might have an assignment that's 6 months. They're not going to come and get their whole apartment if they're going to be here for a short period of time. That is, in my fear, going to further put pressure on those low and moderate income families in a place like Northland, because as Kitty well knows, that housing's not over in Johnstown and that housing's not sitting in Granville. And there's not a place for 7,000 construction workers to set up shop going north, northeast, or east of the Intel construction site. It's all going to be happening in Franklin County. See, this is the problem when I have conversations with smart people. You're always asking the really great questions.
Do we have any other questions for Michael?
Just a comment. It seems that we can't think about 2050. We can't do that. And we can't even think about what's going to happen in the next 2 years with places like Intel. So, I mean, how can we look even longer range? I guess it just seems like our minds are going to explode.
Well, you know, that's a layered, interesting question, given the psyche that we all have after the last, 2.5 years, which has really compromised a lot of us in many ways. I do think, however, what is the beauty of our region? So few of us grew up here. We've come from other places, right? And we live here now. And Columbus has had this kind of consistent growth. Yes, the growth is going to accelerate, but the reality is we are not Austin, Texas. We're not Charlotte. We're not growing like those places. And we don't have the housing costs of a Seattle or San Francisco or Boston. I absolutely believe that in a place like Columbus, when you have thoughtful conversations, when you use data, when you talk about things in a longer term, then I think that you make better decisions and you make different decisions. I think entities like the League of Women Voters, I mean, I think it would be very, very powerful if the League of Women Voters, right, endorses the CODA levy, endorses, zoning code update, goes to these other communities that say, hey, look, Bexley and Worthington and Whitehall and Columbus have done source of income protection. We think this is a good tool. It's not a solution for all, but we would really like for Upper Arlington and Dublin and, Powell to, do the same thing. Because you are agnostic and you're thoughtful and so I think that there are ways to begin to have those conversations to say, let's not react to this immediate thing and let's not have an emotional conversation, but let's have a conversation about the city that we all want to share. One of the things I've been using a lot lately when I think of kind of the built environment and other kinds of struggles that we might have here, because if you look at American-born migration, we tend to get people moving here, American-born people moving here from Cleveland, Dayton, Akron, Detroit, Youngstown. And when you leave Columbus, it is Phoenix, Houston, Dallas, Charlotte, Atlanta, right? People are moving up and out of Ohio. But if we don't build a city worthy of human affection, you won't build a city that people care about. And how do you build a city of human affection? You build a city worthy of human affection by having a built environment that is beautiful, because we will never have water, mountains, and sunshine the way other places do. And the other way you build a city worthy of human affection is you have people who are connected to one another and they build strong social bonds. And just like on a personal level, there's fight or flight, right? In a situation of domestic violence, fight or flight. You live in a neighborhood like Hilltop, it's fight or flight. When you live in the metropolitan region of Columbus, is it fight or flight? Let's build a city worthy of human affection, and we'll build a city that people care about. Catherine, you have your hand raised.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I don't know what's wrong with my camera, but anyway, I'm sorry that I was late to this. I was running errands and didn't get back till late. As you know, our land use committee is trying to put together a series of forums on housing, land use in general. Housing, we've already had issues on affordable housing, and so we're probably not going to cover that as much as the overall land use. And I think Morpsey's 2050 plan is already so far out of date and really wasn't anticipating what was going to happen in the next 10 years, let alone 50. So how do we get people to move away from their plans and come back to a broader picture?
Well, it's an important question. I wish I was a sociologist, right? That I could give you that kind of connective tissue, other than to say is, this is our home. And I think that it's easy to connect with people about what is the legacy that we want to leave to future generations. And some of that is all these things about housing and transportation and land use and the built environment. As someone who loves history, right, I think it's also important to both remind people of where we were and how far we've come, because we have made lots of progress, but it's also about explaining folks those limitations. So as an example, I have lots of friends that are lovely, open-minded, inclusive, great people who live in places like Clintonville and Arlington and Grandview. But they don't really stop and have conversations long-term about, oh my gosh, I live in a community that has the same racial demographics of 100 years ago. And why is it that the laws have changed, but the behavior hasn't? So as an example, I've been having a conversation with the Board of Realtors that says, so why is it that there are tons of Black home buyers that are buying $500,000, $750,000, and $1 million homes, and they won't touch Arlington and Grandview or Dublin with a 10-foot pole, but they're going to New Albany, Gahan, and Pickerington? Why is that, right? Do they not feel welcome in Upper Arlington? What is it about the history of place that continues to define the reality of today? I think history matters. And so all of my good, open-minded liberal friends who live in a place like Upper Arlington who believe in exclusion, and then you ask this question about, so why is it that every single person that lives on your street and the next street and the other street and the street after that look all exactly like you? And what Steve Shoney will tell you, the development director for Arlington, is he said to me, he goes, Arlington is one of those communities where kids grow up here and they love it and they move on and college degrees and they want to come back. But now there's this movement of young college educated people who say, I really, really want to live in Upper Arlington, but I want to start having a family, but I want to have my kids grow up in kind of a different experience than what I grew up in Arlington. And so what he's suggesting is they're seeking greater diversity. And so when it comes to Arlington, how can you look at gentle density? I mean, I give Arlington a lot of credit for what they're doing on Lane Avenue and what they're doing on Kingsdale, but what they're not doing is moving into source of income protection. And what they're not doing is a 20% set aside for these new 5- and 6-story buildings on Lane Avenue and Kingsdale to afford affordable housing. When you think of the median price of a home in a place like Upper Arlington is now like $560 or $570, where does an Upper Arlington police officer or firefighter even Arlington, let alone people that work at the Whole Foods, right? One of the things is, let's have a conversation about, do we want to have a community where police and firefighters and the general manager of Whole Foods can live in the community where they work? And I think Arlington is having a huge, huge movement. There's a group called Equal UA, and there's a podcast now in Upper Arlington called Everybody's Neighborhood or something like that. And so you're starting to see these moments and movement. That's going to happen when people just have thoughtful conversations. That was kind of a long, rambling answer.
Well, I appreciate the answer.
I know we're over time, but I have one comment I wanted to share with the group. I think probably a lot of you don't realize, but the league has had a number of volunteers and members that have been working on the source of income ordinances in a number of communities, and that would include Westerville, Gahanna, Worthington. We
Whitehall.
are trying to work on something in Upper Arlington as well. One of our members is the wonderful Amy Claiborne, who is helping us, yes, with this effort. And we are looking for local league members who live in those specific communities that are interested in going to your city council members. And we have materials that we can give you to send to them to kind of start the issue. So if you're interested, please contact me at the league office, because I agree with Michael. It's a way that we can do local advocacy and get I don't want to say it's easy, but it is something that we can do, and it can be done in as little as a few months, that you can get something with these local communities if they're willing to work with you.
And, please tell Amy Claiborne, I'm part of the Amy Claiborne fan club. And, move to prosper. So somebody said, I live in Wineland Park, right? If you don't know Wineland Park, it's the area along North 4th and Summit, southeast of Ohio State. I've been here 14 years. When I moved in, 20% of my neighborhood was vacant and abandoned. My neighborhood has a 10% home ownership rate. In fact, I'm living on the same street my first apartment was on 34 years ago. So in 3 decades, I haven't gotten very far in life, right? That being said, I live here for a reason, but let's talk about like Amy Claiborne's work around Move to Prosper, because what we know is if you live in a toxic neighbor, in the last 60 days, I've had a couple run-ins with someone with a gun. I won't go into these details, right? But I'm single, I'm an adult. I don't think these things, I think these things happen, but they rarely ever interact with someone like me, right? Very rarely is there random moments of violence that impact someone like myself. 14 years I've been here. I haven't even had as much as a plant taken out of my yard, let alone something problem, right? But Move to Prosper. What Amy Claiborne is saying is, look, even in a neighborhood like mine, which has gone lightning speed with revitalization, it's taken 27 years for campus partners, the Ohio State University, United Way, the Columbus Foundation, Annie E. Casey Foundation, and all these others to stabilize this neighborhood near the Ohio State University, next to the Short North and next to downtown. Well, if you were a young mom, you'd be a grandmother by the time the neighborhood was safe and stable. So we do need to do things that say to that young mom, hey, it is probably the right thing for you to pick up and move out of that neighborhood. And Move to Prosper will provide a couple $100 a month subsidy to keep you stable in your apartment, assigned to a good feeder system with an elementary, middle, and high school. And then we're going to track the health outcomes of the family, the academic outcomes of the children, because what we know to be true is that when children are surrounded by middle class families, they do better. And I'm going to give you a statistic now that is going to break your heart, and it breaks my heart, and I'm going to choke up to even say it. 2 years ago, before COVID, only 41% of Black third graders in the city of Columbus were reading at grade level, which means 59% of all Black kids were not reading where they need to be. And what happens at third grade? You move from learning how to read from reading to learn. And if you can't make that link from learning how to read to learn, you may never catch up. And third grade proficiency is the #1 predictor as to whether or not things are going to work out in your life. 2 years ago, only 41% of Black third graders were on track. It is now 16%. 84% of all Black third graders in our city are not reading at grade level. That is a crisis. It breaks my heart. It is shameful. It will be with those kids maybe their entire lives. And honestly, that is not the legacy that I want to leave behind. And somehow, and you're going to have to delete this from the recording if you're still recording. Hopefully you are still recording. Somehow, our community was able to find